Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Monica Malampalli. I am Healthy Women Senior Advisor for Scientific and Strategic Initiatives. I'm delighted to welcome you to the second session in our Value of Biosimilars in Women's Health three-part roundtable series. Today, our focus is on what providers need to know to utilize biosimilars as treatment options. In 2019, Healthy Women held a one-day forum introducing the concept of what biosimilars means to women's health. The key takeaway was that biosimilars have a significant potential to increase women's access to affordable, life-saving drugs, but barriers still exist when it comes to access and uptake. Among the most notable barriers are lack of patient and provider education. So to help close the knowledge gap, we have gathered diverse experts for discussions on innovations in biosimilars, overcoming challenges and barriers, and what women need to know about the latest treatment options. In fact, last week, you probably heard about our topic on what women need to know about biosimilars. For more than 30 years, Healthy Women has remained true to its founding mission. From the start, we've been committed to creating and broadly disseminating evidence-based and clinically sound health resources tailored for the unique and often overlooked health experiences of women aged 35 to 64. I want to thank Amgen and Viatris for their support in helping us bring this important topic to life. I invite you to visit healthywomen.org to learn more, and I hope you will consider joining us for our final session in the roundtable series next Thursday on March 18th. Now I'm thrilled to welcome our esteemed panel of experts and today's moderator, Dr. Samir Avsari. Dr. Avsari is an Associate Executive Director for Permanente Medical Group, where he is in charge of pharmacy, adult, and family medicine, including pain management and opioid initiatives. He is a board-certified internal medicine physician and joined the Permanente Medical Group in 1993. At Kaiser Permanente, Dr. Avsari also serves as the secretary and chair of the governance committee of the Mid-Atlantic Permanente Medical Group Board. Dr. Avsari has actively spoken and written about embracing biosimilars across the healthcare system, using Kaiser Permanente as an example, including the importance of educating patients and providers on biosimilars. Thank you all for joining us today. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please use the Q&A feature that is towards the bottom of your screen. Once again, please use the Q&A feature and not the chat feature. We will do our best to answer as many questions as we can. Now we'll turn it over to Dr. Avsari. Thank you, Dr. Avsari.
Thank you so much, Monica, and good morning or good afternoon, depending where you are. Before I introduce our distinguished panel, I was also told that there may be patients in addition to physician and providers. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the definition of biosimilars and go through a couple of slides. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about biosimilars, but before I do that, I wanted to start with generic drugs because people know brand name and generic drugs. And generic drugs are copies of brand name drugs. They have the same active ingredient as the brand name drugs, and they're the same in dosage, form, safety, strength, the way they're given, the quality, and the performance characteristics. So the pharmacist would say that generics are bioequivalent to the brand name drugs. Now, biosimilars are made from living organisms, so they can never be identical like generics, but they're highly similar to the reference or the originator product. And biosimilars cannot be exactly reproduced because there's natural variation in the biologic production. But from a patient's point of view, there's no clinically meaningful difference in terms of safety, purity, or potency, which means that they work just as good as the originator product. If you take a look at some of the patents that are expiring in 2023, which there are a lot, this is a $55 billion opportunity for our nation to save on these high-cost medications and to make them affordable to our patients. The utilization rate of biosimilars in the United States is improving. And in 2020, as you can see, one of the biosimilars is almost at 72%. But the lowest uptake is for infliximab, and it's about 14%. So we still have a tremendous opportunity in the United States to have a higher uptake of biosimilars. And then the last slide just shows all of the biosimilars that are approved by the FDA. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just point out that today there are 29 biosimilars that are approved, and 20 of them have now made it to the market. So with that, I want to kind of talk about what we're going to cover today and the questions that we will ask our distinguished panel to address. And here are the 4 questions. So why should healthcare professionals be educated on biosimilars? And what efforts are taking place in this area across the country? We're also going to talk about what barriers are there in utilizing biosimilars and how these can impact women. We will also talk about how can we overcome some of these barriers and build confidence amongst our patients and women in the use of biosimilars. And I guess we won't leave out men either, so them as well. And then talk to you a little bit about what issues there are with reimbursement, insurance coverage, et cetera, that affect bringing biosimilars to our patients. So we have a distinguished panel, and it is my privilege to introduce them. And I'm going to start with Dr. Dennis Cryer. Dr. Cryer serves as the Chief Medical Officer for Cryer Health, which is a patient-centric strategic consulting firm in Washington, D.C. And since 2014, he has been the lead physician co-convener of the Biologics Prescribing Collaborative, providing medical leadership and policy guidance to the Coalition of Physician Specialty Services. Dr. Cryer has had an expansive career spanning academia, he's done research, and he's also a clinical faculty of the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine for over 20 years. He's also been involved with the pharmaceutical industry with Bristol Myers Squibb, and ultimately was the Vice President of External Medical Affairs, serving as external liaison for the advocacy and quality across therapeutic areas. Thank you, Dr. Cryer, for joining us. Next is Dr. Angus Worthing. Dr. Worthing is a practicing rheumatologist at the Arthritis and Rheumatism Associates in Washington, D.C. And he's also a volunteer faculty member of Georgetown, which is where he trained. He currently serves on the board of directors of the American College of Rheumatology and was previously the chair of the ACR's Government Affairs Committee. He has spoken about access to rheumatology care and treatment on behalf of rheumatologists and patients at various US government agencies, including the Congress, the DC Council, the Maryland General Assembly, and state and national rheumatology meetings. Welcome, Angus.
Thank you, Samir. Good to be here.
And finally with us, we have Dr. Stacy Dalpas. Stacy is a pharmacist and serves as a health system clinical leader in the American Society of Health System Pharmacists and the Maryland Society of Health System Pharmacy. Stacy works on a variety of initiatives to reduce drug pricing and increasing drug transparency. She has published a lot in articles, including in the American Journal of Health System Pharmacy on barriers to biosimilar uptake, and is involved in ongoing research regarding prescriber perception of biosimilars. She has practiced in academia, clinical pharmacy, and pharmacy administration. So welcome, Stacy.
Thank you.
All right. So I think we'll just start with a quick round from all of our panelists on telling us why they're interested in biosimilars and if they can speak a little bit about the work that they have done in this space. So let me start with Dennis first. Dennis?
Thanks, Samir.
My interest is based on the fact that I was one of the so-called co-conveners of our Biologics Prescribers Collaborative. It all started back in early 2014 when questions arose about some naming conventions for biosimilars that were being proposed and developed by the American Medical Association. And the concern was that it was that the initial draft of that proposal was ambiguous. And so I got involved in working with them and others on trying to clarify that. Shortly thereafter, a group of physicians was brought together with the specific purpose of looking ahead, basically determining what some of the challenges were going to be as biosimilars were being developed, approved, and marketed. And at that point, nothing had been on the market. 2014, we were still working on draft guidances. And the Biologics Prescribers Collaborative brought several specialty groups of physicians together to develop a common voice, to develop a collaborative approach to reacting to draft guidances, making suggestions, trying to help with refinement, work on legislation, and a variety of other policy types of issues.
Thanks, Dennis. Let me turn to Angus and hear some perspective from him.
Great, thanks, Samir. And I want to thank Monica and Healthy Women for inviting me and including a rheumatologist on the panel with this, as was stated, distinguished group of panelists. I'm a rheumatologist. I want to just quickly say what that is because we have one of the strangest or least known names in the medical field. Rheumatology is the treatment of arthritis and autoimmune diseases, generally in the joints and muscles. We take care of our eponymous disease, rheumatoid arthritis, where people's joints are literally under attack by their immune system. And what gets me up every morning and what I really love to do is taking care of people, especially when I've prescribed a drug like a biologic or a biosimilar, where they come in after starting those medications and this disabling pain that they've had for months or years has finally been relieved, and the look on their faces, it's really special. They get back to work, get back to their hobbies, taking care of their families. So that's a really fun part of rheumatology. And getting on these drugs not only helps pain, but prevents disability from joint damage and improves people's health and lifespan. I got into biosimilars because I was volunteering 5 years ago as my specialty society's government affairs chair, as was mentioned, for the American College of Rheumatology, as FDA was creating language and labels. Labels are, for folks who don't read them every day, these big documents about all of the data, side effects, and successes of each individual drug. And so I was essentially a volunteer lobbyist for my specialty in Washington here. I also then moved on to writing about and talking about biosimilars, and then I've now seen them in the clinic and have been prescribing them. So an important topic for me because our medications in rheumatology are really expensive. The process, as was described, of making programming cells to make these antibodies, these drugs, is expensive, and biosimilars represent a big hope to bringing down costs and increasing access to people.
Thank you, Angus, and I'm going to turn to Stacy next to hear from her.
Yeah, I think, my first experiences, certainly with biologic agents from the time of pharmacy school, but when I went back for my master's degree in public health, I started to investigate more why the situation with biosimilars and utilization in the United States was so substantially different from that in Europe. And that was sort of my first foray into all of the intricacies of uptake of biosimilars in the United States. That interest spawned part of what I did for my practicum and ultimately some of the publications that I've been able to do for biosimilar utilization and looking at barriers at various steps along the way. As a clinical pharmacist, I think I really appreciate the opportunities to tailor care to patients, tailor medication care to individual patients, but also to think about drug pricing, the transparency of drug pricing, and the realization of perceived costs. And so when investigating a little bit more into the passage of the Biologic Price Competition and Innovation Act, which established biosimilars as a possibility, or at least a route for approval of biosimilars, and then looking at it 5 years later and the differences in the cost, the expenditures, I guess, that were actually realized, or savings that were realized. It really led me down a road of discovery as to all of the intricacies of care, and understanding that has been a really fun journey, and then sort of incorporating that into my roles in health system pharmacy as I've progressed through leadership and formulary management and things like that, has just unveiled even more layers of that. And I think we'll continue to see that evolve with time. So certainly an area of interest, but it's going to continue to grow and change, I think, throughout our careers.
Thank you, Stacy. And maybe I'll take a moment to tell you about my involvement with biosimilars. And again, it's very similar to Angus, where I come from my patient's point of view. There are surveys today in this country that show that 1 out of 4 people in our great nation are not able to afford their medications. And biologics are used for several life-changing kinds of diseases, like Angus mentioned, rheumatoid arthritis, cancers, inflammatory bowel disease. I mean, anytime you turn on your TV, you're actually seeing commercials of these things. And what is the use of having these kinds of medications if people really cannot afford them? Because that's really what we want, our patients to be able to take these medications, our women to be able to take these medications and to get better. That's really what we want as physicians and patients. I want to take a moment to actually encourage the audience to send in questions. Remember, there is actually a QA box, so don't put in the chat function, use the QA box. And I don't know, Monica, if any questions have already arrived.
No, not yet.
Not yet.
I mean,
okay.
Not yet, but there was one. Yes, there's one, but we'll wait.
We'll wait a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. Well, maybe we'll shift gears, because we discussed that it's really important to educate not only our patients, but our physicians and our clinicians about biosimilars. So I'm going to put a few questions to our panelists. And the first one is, what was your personal education on biosimilars? And is there a need for education of other healthcare professionals? And maybe I can start with Dennis on that one.
Sure, thank you, Samir. With regard to the second question, there is a need for healthcare professionals, although it's somewhat variable from specialty to specialty. I think there still is a great deal of ignorance or lack of understanding of biosimilars. Now, my own education, I'm largely self-taught, I suppose I should say, in the biosimilars arena, because while well aware of biologics and the incredible value that they have, when I got started on this in 2014, there was a lot of activity at the FDA, but nothing had yet been approved. As I mentioned before, many, if not all, of the guidances for the ultimate development and approval of biosimilars had not been finalized. So by reading things like the BPCIA that Stacy mentioned, the legislation that created this whole process, and reviewing with our member organizations draft guidances and understanding the context of those guidances and the science behind them, I came to develop a fairly good understanding at, again, a kind of a high level. A lot of interactions with the FDA around that too. They were very helpful in educating us in those early days.
Right. Let me turn to Angus and then Stacy to see if they have any additional perspectives on this.
Sure, thanks, Samir. My initial approach with biosimilars was through advocacy, and a lot of what Dennis was just talking about, working as my subspecialist organization's representative to FDA meetings, talking about how this whole process that started with legislation in the Affordable Care Act, actually, Obamacare included biosimilars 2010, how that should be rolled out and how we should go about approving drugs like biosimilars, and then also how doctors should read about them in these labels, the prescriber information. And I think the FDA did a fantastic job in both of those things. We're still talking about some of the details about those things, but that was how I got educated before I even prescribed my first biosimilar. Now, like I said, I'm prescribing them in the clinic. I'm learning about them just like I learn about all the other medications I prescribe. They're also coming out in clinical trials around the world. The United States, unfortunately, is a little bit behind Europe in using biosimilars, and as far as the uptake is concerned and percentages. So we're getting information, for example, from other countries whose groups of patients or whole nations have started using a biosimilar, and the data has been pretty reassuring. And then I've also been an author writing a white paper on behalf of American College of Rheumatology. I've been involved in the updating of a position statement, and I can talk about those later. But so I've seen this from multiple angles, both as an advocate and an author, and prescribing and seeing these drugs work really well.
Thank you. Stacy?
Yeah, so I will say that I graduated from pharmacy school sort of just before the Biologic Price Competition and Innovation Act was passed. So I did not get any formal training in school with regard to biosimilars, but more recently there have been some publications about integrating biosimilar education into pharmacy curriculum in an effort to prepare pharmacy students to be well-versed medication experts with regard to these agents, not only from a clinical perspective, but also from an advocacy perspective and an operational perspective, because there are some pretty substantial operational needs when working to try and provide multiple biologic agents and biosimilars in any kind of practice setting. And so to my understanding, in a quick poll of some of my pharmacy student and recent graduate colleagues, there may be some mention of biosimilars in pharmacy education now, but I think for the most part, we are all relying upon continuing our education as it is pertinent to our practice settings. And so involving curriculum for pharmacy residents and depending upon the practice setting in which they plan to be, education may come from more of an advocacy standpoint, maybe more of an operational standpoint. And then also certainly from a clinical perspective, I think it's important for us to understand what we think we should be doing in order to provide the best care for patients. And so all of that is something that we'll have to continue to stay in touch with literature in order to educate ourselves on.
Yeah, I'll add to that and say that my education on biosimilars kind of started 4 or 5 years ago when the first one came out, filgrastim. It's a medicine that's used to prevent something called neutropenia, which often happens when patients are given cancer treatments and their white blood cell count goes down and makes them more susceptible to infection. And the first one had been released in Europe and it had come here to the United States. And in addition to seeing patients, I have a pharmacy role in our organization. And we brought this medicine up with our oncologists and said, hey, what do you think about using this with our patients? And they said, well, do we have any studies that prove that it works? And I said, yes, we have European studies. They go, European studies? Do we have any American studies? And I think I found them an article from the VA and they go, do we have any Kaiser Permanente studies? And I'm like, not yet. And so what the agreement was that they would treat the next 700 patients with the biosimilar that had just come out. And when they found that there was actually no meaningful difference and their patients just did just as well as the originator product, they were absolutely on board. And as the new biosimilars have come on, our oncologists have definitely been much more comfortable prescribing these biosimilars. So education definitely is still needed. And even in our own organization, which has had a tremendous uptake of biosimilars. So let me go to the next question. I'll start with you, Stacy, and then the third one will go to Angus. So do you want to talk a little bit about what recent developments and efforts have been made in elevating education for patients and clinicians?
Sure. Maybe to focus on patients first, I think
Okay.
there is certainly some information available from the FDA, from the American Society of Health Systems Pharmacy, and certainly a variety of other healthcare provider organizations that focus on educating patients in a variety of different disease state areas. I think one thing maybe on the horizon, or I should say I've seen some organizations do this and I do really like it, I think is partnering patient associations for disease-specific education and sort of partnering with some of these physician organizations. And I've seen some of that, and I really like the engagement that I see from that perspective. For providers, also, of course, the FDA offers a variety of materials. Individual organizations, I think, also provide education from a perspective that is relevant to providers. So I can just say the work I've done with the past 2 health systems that I've worked for, we are always engaging in education with our providers, particularly around additions or changes or restrictions in the formulary and the way that the hospital provides and, well, procures and provides these medications to patients in an appropriate fashion, and sort of the evidence base behind that. So I think that is probably one of the things that'll bring it down to the closest level of matching well with exactly what what providers are attempting to do. I'll put a mention out on the point of provider education. There were a lot of studies that came out around 2016 to 18 on provider perceptions and provider knowledge. I think, moving forward, we're going to need to update those. The provider perception 3 years ago, it has to be different than what it is today. The entire face of the biosimilar market has changed in the last 3 years. And so I think that's another thing sort of on the horizon, is tailoring education to where we are today. And I think that with additional research, we'll be progressing to a point where we can do that.
Great, thanks. Angus?
Sure, talking a little bit about the materials that are out there for providers specifically lately, for the providers on the webinar, and for patients on the webinar, knowing that how your doctor is getting information. Three main ways we get info are the FDA labeling I talked about, like the document for each drug, society documents. So each medical society might come up with their position, or a white paper, like informational, educational paper, or then third, clinical studies, including surveys like Stacy was just talking about, or including data that Samir, you were just talking about. 2 things I would mention. One is a shameless plug, and then another is, I think, a really important clinical study to know about from Norway. The shameless plug is the ACR white paper that I was involved with, which I'll just propose for the providers, and with some of the more technical information about this topic. Came out 2 years ago now, where basically went through the scientific aspects of biosimilars, how they're made and regulated by the FDA, the clinical aspects, how we use them in the clinic, and then the concept of moving, if a patient's doing well with their arthritis, their bowel disease, et cetera, on what's called the originator, kind of think of as the brand drug, and their doctor or their insurance company is considering transitioning over to one of the biosimilars in that class that is similar to the biooriginator. What happens then? And we went through that, as well as some of the potential pitfalls in the US drug distribution system. We are not the best distribution system in the world, and there are entities in the middle that kind of get between doctors or pharmacies and patients. And we talked about that a little bit. But then just going back briefly to the concept of moving from a biooriginator, the so-called brand, to the biosimilar, I think of kind of as air quotes generic. 500 people in Norway were randomized to either continue on their biooriginator or to move over to one biosimilar. And investigators, the scientists, ask the questions, all the questions you want to know. Did the new drug keep working for them? Were there any major side effects? And compared the two groups that stayed on their original drug or who moved to a biosimilar. And the upshot is that they're not different. In both instances, there are some side effects that come up, but they're the same. And in both instances, sometimes the drug stops working. And those were about the same, 25, 30% of people, their drug stopped working. And it didn't really matter if they continued on the biooriginator or if they moved over to the biosimilar. That is called the NOR switch study, very appropriately named, Norway switching people from one drug to another. And I commend people to check that out because it has a lot of reassuring information about biosimilars.
Thank you, Angus. Dennis, anything else to add?
I too would recommend the ACR paper on which Dr. Worthing is an author. It's excellent, very well done, particularly I think for clinicians, but the sophisticated consumer could probably benefit from it as well. The BPC, my organization, has developed educational materials. We started with a handbook, it runs about 30 pages of diagrams and explanations, goes through many of the same kinds of things that Angus just referred to, and is fairly heavily referenced, and I think has been a good resource for some time now for prescribers in particular, although again, a broader audience could appreciate what's in it. It has been updated to include the more recent changes in guidances and such. We have a website where the handbook is located digitally and from whence it can be downloaded. We provide a lot of educational materials there as well. They've generally been targeting physicians, but many, again, would be understandable by patients as well. I think some of the best pieces that we have done are these fact sheets, one page summaries of various topics in biologics and biosimilars. And I think those are very helpful to physicians and patients alike. One last thing I would mention, we developed our handbook prior to the FDA's development of their online materials. And we worked with them, we shared with them the handbook as we were developing it, and then worked with their writers and scientists as they were developing their materials. The interesting thing on the FDA materials, which may be perceptible to Angus and some people, but wouldn't normally be recognized, is that the wording is regulated as anything that the government puts out. So there are some places that may either be hard to understand or maybe a little confusing. One of the conversations we had with FDA was the fact that we were, able to say things in a different way than they were able to say them, and hopefully we're able to make them a little bit more understandable. It's an arcane distinction, but it's something to be aware of. The FDA materials are excellent. They've developed a lot of them, and they will continue to do so. Sometimes, if it doesn't seem to make quite sense, it's because it's within a regulatory framework that it's being developed.
Yeah, thank you, Dennis. I totally agree. The FDA materials are fabulous. They didn't come out till 2019, and our first biosimilar actually came out at the end of 2015. So we actually in Kaiser Permanente had to create our own education materials for our patients and our physicians and our pharmacists. And we found it was important to actually educate our nurses too, because they're often infusing these products. So education was absolutely critical for us to have that uptake. And like Angus mentioned, the research was really important because our physicians wanted to make sure that their patients were doing well. Because they were stable on their medicines. These are life-changing medicines. When you're changing them, they just want to make sure that their patients are doing well. So we have now been doing research, and I'm happy to say that we have the largest US study on infliximab for inflammatory bowel disease, over 3,000 patients that showed no meaningful difference. So we're trying to do that for Herceptin and Rituxan as well, because even though we're all scientists and we don't mind seeing the research from Europe, a lot of our physicians want to see things that are closer to home. So that's quite interesting. So I'm going to ask the last question in this segment, and I'll start. Oh, did you have questions, Monica?
Yes, actually.
Oh,
we
well,
have
let's do some questions.
Yes.
All right.
So one of the questions we did get was, can you provide audience the ACR paper? And just want to let the audience know that Dr. Werding actually posted some information here and a link to the paper. So you should be able to get that from the chat box.
Great.
We actually have a question from Karen McCarrihan. What are some good resources available to help providers, RNs, with conversations with patients? I would like to develop some materials that help my infusion nurses have conversations with patients the day of infusion, especially for the patient who is moving from an originator product to the biosimilar. Anybody wants to take it? Yeah.
That is an excellent question, Dennis. In fact, Stacy mentioned the importance, I think, of getting others involved besides the prescribers, and obviously the pharmacists and PharmDs of the world have been deeply involved from the outset. But we, who started as a physician organization or a group of physician societies, are expanding to include patient advocacy groups and other healthcare professionals. One of our targets, indeed, are going to be nurses, and developing educational materials for them, just as was suggested in this question, will be one of our key objectives here.
Thanks, Dennis. I would add that if you look at the FDA information, they actually have two sets of documents. They have one that are patient-facing, so patients can ask, and the other ones are actually for clinicians, physicians, pharmacists, nurses. So you definitely can go onto the FDA website and get that particular one. And Monica, if we have time, maybe we could find that link and include it into the Q&A.
Sure. All right, we have another question. How do I determine if there might be a biosimilar therapy for my disease?
Angus, should I ask you to start with that one? Yeah.
That's a pretty easy one. You can do some research on your own, or just ask your doctor who's treating whatever disease that is. I will mention right now in the US, as Samir, I think, went over, there's a gap between the number of drugs that have been FDA approved, I think you said 29, and the number of drugs that are actually available for, getting at the pharmacy or the drugstore, or getting through an infusion at your doctor's office. I think you said that there were 20. In rheumatology, especially, there's a bigger gap. We're anticipating that in 2023, we'll probably get 7 to 10 or more biosimilars available on the market that have already been approved. So you can ask your doctor, and if you are rebuffed, know that in a year or two, there'll be more available.
The other thing I would add is you can go to the FDA website. It actually lists most of these biosimilars and which are on market. The CDC, Center for Disease Control, also has that. And oddly enough, Wikipedia has that as well. So any other sources, Stacy or Dennis?
Yeah, I would just say, the Purple Book, the FDA's website, it is a little difficult to search by disease state, for sure. So if you know what you're looking for, you can find it. But if not, it is a little bit more difficult. So, I mean, the only other thing I would bring up is, some of the patient advocacy groups and also patient disease state related groups often are coming up with bits of information on disease states and biologics and biosimilars and sort of the therapeutic options. So that's another potential starting place, but agreed, the best place is the provider who's treating your particular disease state for which you are interested in biosimilar availability.
So
Dennis, any other sources you know of?
No other sources that I know of. It does sometimes take a little bit of digging because one website, the FDA's got some great information, but it's not always as easy for anybody to find, particularly patients that aren't accustomed to digging.
So what I'm hearing is essentially there is a need to be able to provide some of this information easily to patients and providers who might be interested in learning about biosimilars, correct?
Absolutely.
All right. Let's take one more question here. What should providers know about biosimilars? Again, this is a very general question. And if you feel like you've already answered this, we can move on.
We can answer it one more time. So maybe one of our physician panelists, do you want to go, Angus, first?
Well, yeah, this is actually really super easy to answer because the biosimilar is another version of the originator that we've been prescribing for years or decades. So there is nothing new about, as was mentioned, the dose, how frequently a person gets it, how they get it. Is it an injection or an infusion through an IV? Those things are all identical, the way it's used. And so the main things that we learn about a drug, we already know about a biosimilar before it hits the market. It's just becoming comfortable with this concept of how it's therapeutically equivalent. And doctors can know about, find out exactly what was done with clinical trials and with the analytical, like lab-based methods.
And
thank you.
Samir?
Yeah, please.
I would also mention two things, I think. There might be differences for certain biosimilars, and the instances in which that may occur is where the method of administration, usually an injection is what I'm thinking of, and maybe a device that was developed by the originator company. In that case, the originator company owns the design of that device and probably has patents on it that will not permit it to be identically replicated. So the patient with the biosimilar version may, if they're doing self-administration in particular, may be faced with something a little bit different that they need to learn about. It behooves the physician to know in advance that this is going to be the case so that the patient isn't surprised and think they have the wrong thing. The other thing I did want to mention is that I think I did a lot of time in basic science research, and so I always want to see the data, whether it's from Europe or the US. I want to read it carefully. I want to see the numbers. I want to see the statistics. And before the first approval, even with the first advisory committee, I still was a little uncomfortable because we just didn't, in the US, have experience on, particularly around safety as we introduced these. There was good data from around the world, but and looking carefully at the approval process, the information required for approval has really very, very little clinical data in it on the biosimilar compound or preparation. Most of the data in the package insert, to which Angus referred, is from the originator compound. Virtually all the clinical data is based on it, and that's okay. That's the rule. I mean, that's. But the question was, how's this going to play out? Because it was all based. The largest portion of the approval was based on very sophisticated laboratory studies and analyses that most clinicians would never understand. And so it was hard to really say, well, yeah, that's clinically equivalent. But now that we have gotten some of these on the market, we see the kind of regulation that's going on with the manufacturing of the biosimilars, which is keeping everything safe from the front end. I think we can all have a great deal more confidence than we did before the first one was approved, and we were asking a lot of questions.
Thank you. Stacy, anything from a pharmacist perspective?
Well, I think the other thing that I would add to things I would want providers to know, providers of all sorts to know, is maybe taking this from a slightly different tack, understanding what the payer mix is for your patient population, and what their formulary regulations and restrictions are on any of the biosimilars or biologic agents in the classes that you're planning to use. Because most of the current biosimilar agents are really, by and large, administered in the outpatient setting or the ambulatory setting. We are really dependent upon the payers to ensure, but well, I shouldn't say dependent upon. It is very important to understand the payer formularies and any restrictions they have on administering a biologic agent, because that will ultimately drive, to some extent, affordability and what you may need to engage in with your pharmacy department, your formulary, your P&T committee, and also within your own practice for what will be administered to patients.
Thank you. I think we'll shift gears and move to the next section and talk a little bit about what barriers there are to the uptake of biosimilars in the United States. And I'll list a few of them. We've talked about some of them. One is the lack of information and the support to our patients and clinicians. There's also something called over-patenting, and sometimes there's things called pay for delay. And I think our financial payment models in this country are somewhat misaligned. But I think there may be other issues that you may want to bring up as well. So let me start with Dennis and see what ideas you have on this particular topic, barriers to uptake in the United States.
Again, I think largely it's understanding and acceptance. I think, as I mentioned earlier, and I think others have alluded to, it varies quite a bit from specialty, especially rheumatology, Dr. Worthing's specialty. That group is very attuned to biologics and biosimilars. Many physicians use few or may use no biologics. They may not have a clue about them, and they may need some basic education, basic understanding to feel comfortable about them. Think about the primary care physicians, who in general are not administering biologics, but their patients may be on them. And think about the questions that they may get from their patients about the biologics or the biosimilars. And that's a group. And I would include in the primary care group OBGYNs, because for many women who, through a large part of their age, their primary care is delivered by their OBGYN. And the other piece of that, if that's their main source, the woman often is the gatekeeper to healthcare in the home. And so the woman's primary care provider needs to understand these things, needs to be comfortable, needs to be able to communicate that to the patient. That patient may actually be asking questions about their parent. The women more often are caregivers for their elderly parents. Anyway, I'm going on and on, but there are lots of opportunities there, I think, and barriers to be overcome.
Thank you, Dennis. I'm going to turn to Angus for his perspective.
Sure, thanks. From my perspective, the piggybacking on what Dennis just mentioned, women are predominantly, unfortunately, affected more than men by autoimmune diseases. We don't know why exactly, but for example, about 3.5% of women have rheumatoid arthritis, whereas just over 1.5% of men have rheumatoid arthritis at some point in their life. And so women are going to benefit from biosimilars more than men, and barriers are going to be more important to women. In the clinic, the first barrier, like I mentioned, is marketing and availability. Like FDA might have approved a drug that's been diligently produced and studied, but it might not be on the market yet. And that's a patent issue or a decision on the behalf of the drug company to put it into the marketplace. So I may know about a drug that's been approved, but I can't get it, or the patient can't get it. Second, like anything in the world, is time. So I need the time and I need to have a good amount of time to talk to people. You're doing well on your drug X. I want to tell you a little bit about the biosimilar that's available for drug X, what I think about biosimilars, what it is. I want my patients to know risks and benefits of everything we're doing. And I want to be able to frame, as an important concept, moving to a biosimilar or using a biosimilar as their initial drug. I want to frame that positively to let them know that I feel like this is therapeutically equivalent to the drugs we've been using before, that hopefully they or somebody in the system is going to save some money. Sometimes that doesn't happen with the patient. And then finally, the last thing that's sort of frustrating to me actually is about half the time that I've gotten through those two things, we've gotten the drug, I've had the time in clinic to talk to people, I prescribe the drug and then it's not covered. And this is the weirdest thing in my specialty right now, that the less expensive drug doesn't get covered because of, like I mentioned, the challenges in the drug distribution system. Sometimes this is because formulary, the list of preferred drugs might include drugs that were able to buy their way into the formulary, or which is kind of an auction these days in the United States. And the highest and the preferred status goes to the highest bidder. And just to very much simplify this process, the highest bidder might need to increase their cost in order to get that bid through. So those are the main barriers. I have had success despite those barriers. About half the people I've prescribed and taken the time to talk about it with, they're doing just fine, just as expected on the biosimilar. But we do have a ways to go.
Thank you. Stacy, something quick to add?
Sure. I mean, I think that was a great job describing some of the barriers to payment and being one of the big steps in the process of getting the medications to patients. I guess maybe the last thing that I'll add is policy. So state policy and national policy can be barriers to utilization of the drug. I would say most states have progressive pharmacy law that allows for the pharmacy to make some decisions about interchanging biosimilars or using the least costly alternative if possible. I think those that are more liberal with that actually may have better uptake of biosimilars, particularly if they don't require interchangeability. So I think that in many ways, state policy can support biosimilar use. Although at this point, I think in a lot of cases, it doesn't really help it. So I think that's one of those areas of opportunity for enhancing uptake.
Thank you. So I'm going to get to our final question for all of our panelists, and I'll ask you to be a little bit brief and say, the question is, what would be the one thing that you would want to share with our audience that would be most important regarding the value of biosimilars in women's health? I'll start with Dennis.
I think I'll just reiterate what I said before. The safety of biosimilars, I think, has been pretty well determined and described. It's important for organizations like yours, Samir, to continue to do research and to continue to publish your experiences so that more confidence and comfort can be achieved, because the producers of the biosimilars probably are not budgeting to do comparison trials unless they think they've got an advantage. So basically, the comfort with the with these that we as specialists are comfortable, and we just need to do what we can to help prescribers and patients to be comfortable as well.
Thanks, Dennis. Angus?
I would just say let's focus on that moment where patients and their prescribers are talking face-to-face in the clinic, and they're able to frame this move to a biosimilar in a positive way. But also, we want patients and doctors to stay in the driver's seat deciding about our healthcare. So we want the biosimilars to be available, and we want people and their doctors to be able to make those decisions with informed consent, with looking at all the positives and negatives, and be able to have a good moment framing that positively.
Thank you. And finally, Stacy.
Yeah, I think that's a great depiction of sort of shared decision making at its best. And I think that biosimilars are have a lot of nuances, a lot of peculiarities, if you will, that make that time of education and time to discuss the decision really important. But I think the other thing I'd want for people to know about it is that we have the ability to impact some things around uptake of biosimilars, and that includes things like advocacy. We've seen advocacy work in the past as Medicare Part B has incentivized the use of biosimilars. I think there are definitely additional complexities with regard to private payers and PBMs. But I think, looking at alternative policies to expand incentives for the least costly alternatives that are equally efficacious is important as well. And I think something that everyone can be a party in.
All right. Well, thank you. I want to take a moment to thank this distinguished panel, Dennis, Angus, and Stacy. Thank you for spending time with us. I had some concluding comments, and I'll start with that. About 4 years ago, when I got involved with biosimilars, there were 14 medications approved by the FDA, but only 3 were available on the market to patients. And at that time, Europe had 53. And today, the FDA has approved 29, and 20 are on the market. So I'm feeling much more optimistic. And I would say that the availability of biosimilars in the market actually increases competition. Competition actually lowers prices. Lower prices means that people can access these life-changing medicines. After all, as a patient and physician, that's what we want. Healthier women, and yeah, we'll include the men as well. So let me hand it over to Monica to see if she had any questions or concluding comments.
Yeah, thanks, Samir. Actually, unfortunately, we're out of time. I think there was so much to discuss today, and hope we can come back and continue these conversations. But again, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And on behalf of Healthy Women, I want to thank Dr. Al-Sawi and our panelists for this engaging conversation. And more importantly, thank you for those who were able to join us today. And if you still have questions for us, please, I encourage you to write an email to us at webinars@healthywomen.org, and we'll get back to you with answers from our panelists. And again, I finally want to thank our sponsors, Amgen and Viatris, for making this event possible. And I hope everyone can again join us next Thursday at noon for our final roundtable in this 3-part series. Again, thank you, everyone. Goodbye.